Hello and welcome to News Club. I'm your host Em, and this is where we talk about the news and what to do about it. I'm joined once again by Debs and Chivers, and today we have a fantastic new speaker and guest, Kate. Can you maybe formally introduce yourself a little bit, Kate?
Sure. I'm Kate Checker. I'm a comedian and a writer and an artist.
Let's get right into it. Today we'll be talking about a couple of things from Welsh independence to what's happening in Gaza, in Iran, and P. Diddy. So, starting off with the increased support for Welsh independence. It seems that recent polling shows nearly 40% of Welsh voters back leaving the UK, especially younger generations. Campaigns like Yes Cymru and Labour for Indie Wales have grown in prominence, and dissatisfaction with Westminster over austerity, devolution limits, and post-Brexit governance has definitely been part of fueling that shift. So, really, I think our discussion is going to center around whether statehood the answer to centralized power. If power shifts from London to Cardiff, who will be in control? What does that look like? Who gets to say what happens? And are there other things we can maybe look to in terms of securing or supporting or challenging these independent movements? So, Kate, why did you want to talk about this, and what does Welsh independence represent for you politically?
Why did I want to talk about it? Because you said bring a news story. And so I went onto Novara Media, and this is a story. And I guess it's not one we've heard a lot about because people talked obviously a lot about Scottish independence. And there was like a referendum. And it's very clear that I think the majority of Scotland probably at this point would now like to leave the Union. And people don't talk that much about Welsh independence. And so I was quite intrigued by it. It doesn't mean anything for me. I'm not Welsh. I grew up near Wales, but it wouldn't really affect me in any particular way if Wales left or not. Nothing I would sort of notice imminently. It depends what their border controls were like, I guess. But I just think it's an interesting case to have. And I think it's interesting that I guess it's like a dissatisfaction with Labour in both cases have like caused these other parts of the UK that are much more socially minded, maybe we would say. Like these countries seem to be much more interested in, I think it was Scotland recently that said it wanted to like put, this is so crazy that this is like a radical idea, but it wanted to put like human well-being or people's well-being or something at the center of their political like policies and stuff. Imagine, like, it's like crazy. Like, what do you mean they're going to put the people first? That's so crazy of them. What about the abstract economy? But yeah, I just think it's kind of like funny that this is what people can conceive of as an alternative, I guess, in these moments in time when you say like, oh, I really just don't like how the politics are. Well, like one option we have is we could leave. And I guess I'm interested in the politics also of like of leaving stuff, of like that being a way to escape from something, like, you know, the ability to be able to leave. Like I think it also touches on lots of things about like immigration and Brexit and this, you know, when you don't like something, well, I'm out, and whether we think that's a good idea or not.
But yeah, and on borders as well, in terms of even like ease of passage, as you say, like how would that actually affect us? Well, that's one way I think that more immediately affects us, whether or not I can go to London, and like enjoy the beach, Very niche example, but anyways. I mean, something that does come to mind, I will say, is like you do see and you feel a difference. As someone who's lived in both England and Scotland, there is a very clear difference in terms of how there are certain approaches in terms of like the effects of devolution, how that affects our education, how that affects our health. Even recently, I was talking to someone about the benefits of living in Scotland again, and the fact that you just don't have to pay for medication. It's a small thing, but it's an important thing, and it makes a massive difference to a lot of people's lives. And we have devolution to thank for that. And recently spoke to someone who told me that they stopped voting Tory and started voting for SNP, which I thought was quite curious actually, because one thing such as independence can switch someone to be like, yeah, I'll support a party who has been able to, I guess, have what we'll call slightly more progressive politics than yeah,
Yes, I
the
mean, I
Tories.
guess we tend to think of SNP voters as historically like dissatisfied Labour voters, but maybe it's it's something else.
A mix of them, definitely. Tom, you're unmuted.
I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, the SNP in terms of Scotland, yeah, in more recent years has been disaffected Labour voters. But before that, it was very much seen as much more adjacent to the Tory party, like in the 70s. So you get this kind of redrawing of the lines. Wales has been such a solid Labour place for kind of ever since the Labour Party existed. And so, yeah, it's interesting to see how, under whatever, how many years was it? 14 years of Tory rule that we just had, and you had then a Welsh Labour government that in some ways was quite popular. I mean, it kept being re-elected, and it was interesting to see how like Starmer never ever would talk about that. Like, he would never talk about Wales as a success story for the Labour Party, because he didn't want to acknowledge that there's obviously these, like, more left-wing policies that are actually popular. Like you say, on this, like, it's nothing wild here, but it's literally just like not having to pay for prescriptions or things to do with the way the buses work or whatever. But I suppose in a more general sense, to what extent do we think that new other kinds of nationalism are a solution to the problems of, like, the British state? And I think there is a way that the British state has this particular thing, because it used to run an empire, and it's still kind of like dripping in that blood. And so there is something that is a bit different about literally any institution that is not Westminster. Is like, it's not going to be, I mean, literally, the House of Lords is one of the most corrupt institutions in the world. Like, there's no way, I'm not, like, things have been bad at Holyrood, right? Like, it has not been, but what you don't have is a set of, like, unelected people being paid like £400 a day to sit there and lobby on behalf of, like, the oil industry or whatever. So I would say there's always an argument for, like, pushing power out of Westminster, because it's going to be a fairer fight between the people and an institution that is not Westminster than things being kind of concentrated there. So in general, I mean, I fully support the breakup of the British state. I think it is our best chance of being able to, get into a bit of a fairer fight with our institutions. But of course, it's, you're still creating, it's still just another form of the nation, another form of the state that then carries all of those same problems of, like, Wales is hugely concentrated around Cardiff and around the southwest or the southeast of the country. Yeah, there's massive, massive inequality, absolutely terrible public transport system. Yeah, there's lots of things that from the outside in Wales can look quite good, and then you talk to Welsh people about them, and they're like, yeah, sort of like it. Yeah, it's not a socialist utopia, sadly.
Exactly. And even like the language disparity and the way that people feel, and the north-south divide, which we also see in England and even across Scotland as well. Like, these are recurring themes that we feel all the time. For like a very niche example of something that's kind of like annoying about living in Scotland co-ops is HMOs, and the fact that it's actually very hard to sometimes establish certain kinds of cooperative housing structures because of this legislation, which doesn't actually affect people in England in the same way that it does here. And I think when we are more devolved or more independent, there is like an easier ability to be able to then put pressure on the state, pressure on policy reform, pressure on all these different angles, let's say, in terms of how we create change. But yeah, like you say, there's fundamentally the aspect of it, which is the presence of statehood in and of itself and the limitations that brings, which actually made me think also about BBC mutualisation. Like, what does a divided almost of sorts, or a fully independent nation, independent UK look like for BBC mutualisation?
A great time to ask, because just last week I started it's an academic project rather than a campaign, but a new project exactly looking at how could you devolve the powers of broadcasting in this country. I mean, moving away from sort of independence and nationalism a bit, the devolution experiments across Wales, Scotland, and partly the English regions have produced lots of new powers over transport and housing and healthcare and education. But the media has always been left out of that equation. So what we're doing in this new project is looking a bit at, like, okay, well, if we want devolution or more independence or more local powers to give people a greater say and a greater role over things that happen in their communities, why wouldn't you include media in that equation as something that is so central to people's understanding of their communities, people's understanding of their identities? So even unrelated to BBC mutualisation, just basically saying, we all seem to think devolution is broadly a good idea of giving people power in their own communities. But if you don't include the media in that experiment, then you've got a completely disparate relationship between how you are involved in your local communities and how you can know about your local communities, and how the information and ideas about your region or your town or your nation is actually created by media institutions. Wales is such an interesting place for this, because they have had, to some extent, a bit of a devolved media in the formation of S4C back in the 1980s or 82, which came off of actually quite a radical campaign by Welsh language campaigners of doing things like painting over road signs that were only written in English and writing the Welsh place names on road signs, or climbing up broadcasting towers and knocking down the aerials. So they stopped receiving a predominantly, exclusively English BBC broadcast coverage. The campaign to get Welsh language television started with direct action, effectively, of people going to spots of English linguistic domination and literally tearing them down or writing over them. So, there's huge prospects there. On the politics, I think, I may have just misread this, but I think Nigel Farage had said, when we're standing reform candidates in Wales, they will be pro-devolution candidates. So Reform are very much trying to move into that space of, as Deb said, they also see that there are huge economic inequalities in Wales. Some parts of Wales have been as badly hit by Thatcherism and deindustrialisation as many parts of the north of England. And they've sort of been pigeonholed away in that, because Wales is devolved, that's sort of an issue over there and it's part of that settlement. But yeah, the political, whether it's sort of devolution or revolution, right? Is it a case of, if we give Wales a few more powers, things will be better? Or has it got to the point where the issues within Wales as a nation and its economy and its identity and its language actually do need a complete break from, not having to scrabble to Westminster and say, can we have more powers, please? It's no, we're going to go our own way. And where will Reform as the sort of ascendant political power in the country stand in that could be interesting, and probably not for very good reasons, because I don't believe Nigel Farage is saying those things out of the goodness of his heart. I think he's saying those things because he wants Reform to win in Wales and to capitalise on Labour's loss. So, yeah, we'll have to wait and see, I suppose.
Yeah. I'm curious, Kate, actually, in terms of how you integrate politics and talking about this in your comedy, actually, how these two things come together and how that also forms part of the extended discourse that we have available through laughter, through comedy, to also transform how we see things, how we engage with media, how we engage with ideas such as independence. Have you been able to do any shows in Wales?
I don't think I have ever done any shows in Wales, actually. Everyone says they're the craziest audiences you get are in Wales. Someone will get naked. They're always really rowdy. I love it. But I've never done one.
I would love that. I would love that. Now I need to go to Wales and see one of your shows there, hopefully. Hopefully we get that kind of audience.
Yeah, so they're quite feral, basically.
I think Glaswegians on a Friday night. Same vibe.
Yeah. Which I'm fair play, No one's watching you.
Very true, very true.
And I suppose the thing in Wales, like Tom was saying, there's been all of this kind of cultural this cultural movement for the last 60, 70 years, which has had this absolutely massive success, which is that it's revived a language that was on the verge of dying out, and that there's loads to show for that, right? So S4C, for context, for anyone that's never been to Wales and doesn't know, this is what Channel 4 is on Channel 4 in Wales. They can obviously now receive just regular Channel 4 through the internet. But yeah, and it's Welsh language. But there's also, a whole kind of cultural scene of Eisteddfods and Welsh male voice choirs, and there's a lot of cultural life, I think, in Wales. And there's a really interesting platform called Am Cymru, which was created as a kind of digital arts platform. So I think that's the stuff that there's obviously the people that are kind of working towards the formal politics and formal ideas of independence, but there's actually, I think, more of what I've understand of going on is this more grassroots cultural concept of what Wales is and what it can be. And within that as well, people who are really obviously trying to push back against a kind of nativist idea of Wales, an independent Wales is really there for the truly Welsh people that have been here for time, and instead trying to have this more expansive idea. There's someone, I'll need to look up his name, but there's a black guy he's a rapper, and he raps partly in Welsh and in English. Is a rapper, a black guy, raps in both Welsh and English, and I think there was a whole controversy about whether or not he could perform as part of this Eisteddfod because he doesn't just rap in Welsh. But he was really kind of pushed back on this, being well, let's not be held by this idea of a kind of tradition that excludes loads of people. Actually, I'm part of this tradition because I'm bringing it into the 21st century. So there's people like me that will keep this thing alive.
Absolutely, that's really beautiful. And already talking about culture, I think this also opens the door for the next conversation that we're going to have around this industry, around the arts culture sector. Yeah, I mean, beyond the fact that we know that a lot of it is built on unpaid labor, instability and unequal access, as most other industries, if not all industries. We also want to see this exploitation, I guess, Debs, through the lens of not just the economic, but the personal, the violent, the interpersonal, and the ongoing revelations surrounding P. Diddy, also known as Sean Combs, including the lawsuits, surveillance footage, and survivor testimonies. So yeah, what do they have to say about exposing an industry where wealth and status often protect abusers?
Yeah, so this is the P. Diddy, Sean Combs case, which is currently, the trial is currently ongoing in the States. P. Diddy obviously was a rapper, a kind of media mogul worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and he's on trial for a whole range of things like sex trafficking, sexual assault. There's been accusations of him firebombing Kid Cudi's car, drugging and assaulting multiple men and women, terrorizing his staff. And yeah, I mean, it is like a really, really grim story. Part of the reason I wanted to talk about it is there's so much AI generated content coming out about this. And so this trial has coincided with the AI tools getting to a certain stage. The reason that it came to my mind was that my friend was just telling me the other day, oh, did you know Rihanna took the stand? And I was like, what? I did not know that. But the video was AI generated. There's a little YouTube rabbit hole that you can go down where there's things saying that Rihanna took the stand, that Gwen Stefani took the stand, that P. Diddy and 50 Cent had like an altercation in the courtroom. So there's this stuff which is like total clickbait, just making things up. And there's also a whole load of stuff out there which actually isn't misinformation, but it's just AI generated. Like there's a whole podcast series that you can listen to. And I started listening, and after a while I was like, this is really weird. Like they've not introduced themselves. They've not said who's made this. And I was like, oh, this is a podcast made by AI. So I think there's something there. And like this whole thing kind of really lends itself to a certain kind of conspiracism, partly because it involves all these big names, these people that you know about, and like all of these rumors going around. So yeah, there's something about people keeping their wits about them when they're looking for information on this and trying to make sure it's something that you're finding from multiple sources. And yeah, and I guess the kind of key thing around this is obviously that it was capitalism all along. Like it's in the trial, it's all focused on this one person. It's like, what did he do? And when did he do it? And it sounds like he's like a horrible, violent person. But clearly he was enabled by like hundreds, thousands of people who also got really rich out of this whole system of exploitation, including loads of white people made loads of money out of this man. And so alongside the criminal trial that's going on, there's also all of these civil cases and all of these people that are trying to get financial settlements. And I think what's significant about them is that they're not just naming P. Diddy, they're naming all of the companies. And they're saying, you are also responsible for this thing happening because you knew what this man was like and you just enabled him for like years and years and years. So I think that that's why it's interesting to me as a story of like how capitalism works right now.
Do you think it will be somewhat successful in terms of also implicating the wider systems and corporations that were involved throughout the many years in which they facilitated what he did?
I really have no idea, because we had Me Too, and then we had like the Johnny Depp Amber Heard case was like a big backlash kind of against Me Too. But this case seems to be almost like a backlash against that. And obviously there's this big theme of racism in that, right? Of like people are much more willing to believe that this man did it than Johnny Depp because of racism. But yeah, there is something about the way that it's so many people are tied up in it. And it partly depends, I think. There's this idea of like there's a kind of Diddy list. There's a list of other people that will, explicit witnesses that saw sexual exploitation happening, that were there at these parties, and that is at some point that going to get released? Are these other people also going to get caught up in court proceedings? Or is it something where a bunch of a bunch of people will be paid off and a bunch of things will be kind of held within non-disclosure agreements, and we'll never really see? That's usually what happens, right? Like people cover their asses and one guy goes to jail, maybe 3 guys go to jail, but the overall system stays in place.
And that's often the story, isn't it? And what does it look like specifically in the arts to transform that in terms of what we can do, in terms of who we can support, in terms of how we create and preserve and protect in parallel to these systems?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, about how to bring this story, which is clearly so distant from most people's lives, into something that people could take action on. And I guess one of the things is that in some ways this kind of exploitation that P. Diddy was caught up in and perpetuating is kind of old school, right? It's literally like getting people into a room and doing horrible things to their bodies. Whereas the kind of exploitation that actually, for example, lots of musicians face now is much more like an algorithm taking all of your money. And, I mean, we were just talking about the problems of trying to even talk to any of these big platforms. It's like, if you could even talk to a person, like that would actually be a massive improvement. And so I think there's some stuff around the problems of streaming and streaming services. And, so please, like, support your musician friends, go to gigs, buy their EPs, buy their music on Bandcamp, like not just seeing streaming as something which is sort of supporting musicians and artists, because it really isn't. Like the amounts that people get are so incredibly tiny. And then also, I mean, if you are a musician, I think this is a really good time to join a union. The Musicians Union is currently trying to get fairer terms from Spotify and kind of, negotiate fairer revenue streaming. But also because we had this piece of legislation passed last year, which has a very long title, but the acronym is the DMCCA. And it creates this framework for big tech platforms to be sort of forced to negotiate with people who they're exploiting. The first company that's likely to be named is Google, but others will be named, including things like Amazon and Apple, probably, who have these big streaming services. And it's, we're thinking about that a lot because we're trying to organize independent publishers to negotiate with those platforms. But there will be an opportunity, I'm assuming, for the musicians to get together and to negotiate and say, because a lot of what they say is streaming services are often run at a loss because they generate value for the platform in other places, but the musicians aren't seeing any of that value. So I do think this is actually a really good time for artists to get together, become part of these collectives and be represented, because I think there will be a pushback and opportunities for more collective organizing coming up.
Absolutely. And I would love to hear your experience as a comedian, as someone in the creative industry, Kate, as well. Like, what does that look like in practice?
For payment or regarding exploitation?
Regarding exploitation, regarding all of how these things relate, regarding what you told us, what was it, Meta?
Yes, about my £10 in Meta. I mean, there's like a two-sided things of like the problem of predatory men exists also within comedy. I mean, I wouldn't argue so much that people are so quick to believe that P. Diddy did it because he's black. I don't think that's what played out. I think that people are quick to believe it because there was like so much more evidence and there were so many more people saying it. Whereas with Amber Heard, it was just like one singular person. I think the reason which took P. Diddy so long to, and it's, it's been going on for a lot longer, arguably, than Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. I think what took P. Diddy like longer was because maybe the victims were black women, a lot of them, and people are not really have a tendency to believe women of color and black women particularly. And there's a lot of predators in comedy as well, and that's like an ongoing problem that keeps being raised and just happens in, I think, a lot of industries that are about entertainment and are surrounded by like a lot of alcohol and a lot of people who really want this thing and really want to become, Cassie also wanted to become a singer, and now you're attached to these people that say they're going to make your career for you. So you're really, really vulnerable to exploitation, I think. And I think big companies have also played on that desire, the real desire to make it in your art because you love to do it. Similarly been like, how you have a system now where all these clips of you end up online, sometimes with or without your consent, and you also have to then chase that, and like, who gets paid for any of that? Because there isn't really, they make tons and tons of money off you and you don't see any of it until you hit like certain loopholes they want you to hit, or you're supposed to make money through other sources, which is like more complex if you're a political comedian. Like, I'm not getting sponsorship deals for like wine brands because they say things that are maybe more controversial than the wine brand would like to be attached to. So then, I mean, it's just a huge issue. I don't know what you do with that though, short of the revolution.
I mean, have you been able to organize or like be in collectives with people, or would you be interested in
We're trying to
engaging
start
more?
that right now because of that act. We're trying to start something around that right now, which is how I ended up here on this podcast. But that's, I mean, in the works.
But it's exciting all the same, I would hope.
Yeah, I don't know. It depends if you like meetings, It's like any union. Like, I became a comedian because I'm hyper independent and I like to tell people my opinion, Like, I'm not that so fussed about sitting around in like, having large meetings where everyone needs to be heard. But that's kind of what happens when you do collective action. I spoke to someone from Equity this morning, which is our union. And he was like, that's my whole job. And I was like, great. Perfect. We need people like you.
And how do we make meetings more fun? Because we've spoken about this before in the podcast, right? Like how much we dislike oftentimes the really like overly prescriptive and like classical ways of engaging with people in a room. Like and the fact that we know we can spice those things up, we know that we can make them more interesting. We know we can actually like engage on these because it's all very serious, but we're able to um still be emotionally connected, spiritually connected, and be able to know that we're like sharing this fundamentally because of what we have in common and what we desire for ourselves and for others. I think also is a good reminder, and it's why I quite like doing things around festivals, doing things around bigger events, because it then allows us to be able to see this conversation exist alongside our our joy, our frustration, our anger, all of it. I see you nodding, Tom.
I thought you were, when you started off by asking how do we make meetings more fun, I was dreading that you were going to ask me an answer because I'm not the person to ask. No, I think that feeling I get coming off of doing these recordings or having meetings with people in this movement we've put together, are actually like, you go, that was a really long meeting and lots was discussed and now I've got to do stuff. And then you think, wait, I came out of that with stuff to do. That's really unlike most kind of meetings I go into, where actually people say, right, we're going to finish this and this is what we're doing next. And then we're going to go and like organize an event or call someone else up or get something done. I think really just starting from those basic steps of like, you're not just meeting for meeting's sake, you're meeting to find stuff that you can do individually, whether it's join something or chat to someone else to get them involved. That's the best I can offer as the most boring meetings oriented person in this call. But I mean, it works, right? Getting people to do stuff works because then people can feel that the stuff they've been talking about sort of actually exists and does something
and
in life.
materializes beyond just a conversation, which is what we're often used to, definitely. And I guess in the case of creative arts, of industry, of all of that, we see it materialize in the form of music, in the form of comedy, in the form of art pieces, exhibitions, whatever that looks like, and it can be so revitalizing, I find. So in terms of being serious about changing culture and organizing from below, Debs, you've already mentioned in terms of supporting local artists, but how else can we make that happen? How else do we give our support, perhaps?
I already told you all of my ideas.
I'm curious to know some from Kate as well. I don't know if you have any notions on how you would rather be supported as an artist from others.
How to be supported?
Yeah.
I mean, the simple thing is just payment, really, which is like that's the problem of capitalism ongoingly. Is just like, pay people for their time, pay people for their labor, pay people for the use of their stuff, and then you can ask people to come to live comedy shows, but I don't think there's good. I don't think asking for it is going to get people to come to live comedy. So I don't know what to say. I can't be like, please come. Like it's summer.
Definitely, yeah. You're right. I think trying to get to something directly isn't always the path, I definitely find. But knowing at least where you want to be is really helpful. So support your local artists.
Yeah, for support, go to live comedy events.
All right then. Well, last point, last discussion, and we're going to hear a lot more from each of us on this a little bit. So you've introduced us to the media's monitoring latest report. Their latest report finds that BBC coverage of Gaza and Israel overwhelmingly favors the Israeli state. Palestinian voices are marginalized, Israeli deaths are given more prominence, and terms like siege or apartheid are rarely used despite human rights consensus. And so, it feeds a distorted public understanding and narrow space for solidarity. And I guess our questions around that is like, what happens when the media becomes a mouthpiece for state violence? Who gets to be mourned? Who gets to be erased? So what links would you say this has to just generally how we cover the media, the way repression plays out elsewhere?
There's never really like a good time to release a report about how completely fucked the media has been in its coverage of Palestine. But I think this week, especially with the attacks and missile exchanges between Israel assassinating Iranian military officials, Iran responding with missile attacks, and that now being in its fourth day of missile exchanges and attacks on civilians and military facilities, and it all just looking sort of very scary and out of control in the broader region. Having a report that reminds people that Palestine is still there and still under an occupation and a siege, and that has partly been aided and abetted and supported by the way that Western media, and particularly large institutions like the BBC, have completely taken hook, line, and sinker the Israeli perspective on the conflict and parroted Israeli talking points, completely dismissed any Palestinian perspectives. And actually, like the stats in the Centre for Media Monitoring report are absolutely jaw-dropping. I think it reinforces what broadly people already know and feel about the coverage of Palestine, which is that it's completely one-sided. But to see it in statistics and numbers and really hammered home, this is the extent to which, like, the notion that Palestine exists and that there are Palestinian people who have been bombed and starved and like captured and imprisoned in this occupation is like completely absent from BBC coverage, whereas the Israeli state's perspective on everything it is doing is whitewashed and supported and given carte blanche by the BBC, which is supposed to have all of these vaunted principles of impartiality and balance and accuracy and so on. I think I just wanted to read, the Byline Times did a coverage of the report, and they've got here a quote from an anonymous BBC journalist kind of responding to the report, and I think their comment is so fascinating. So this journalist has said, one BBC member of staff told us that UN sources cannot be trusted. Palestinian or any sources perceived to be Muslim are treated with suspicion even when they are Western academics who happen to be Palestinian or Arab by heritage. There is a total lack of journalistic standards and ethics, especially when dealing with the IDF. IDF propaganda statements are treated as statements of fact. Scripts are peppered with Israeli right to replies without any legal or ethical basis. BBC staff perpetuate Israeli untruths in scripts and meetings, and on a few occasions they expressed surprise when we told them Israel had been found to be lying and so that we could not use Israeli statements as fact. Pro-Israel lobby groups and lobbyists are mentioned by name in editorial meetings, and we saw firsthand how the BBC's journalism is led by its fear of these lobbyists. So we've got numbers and accounts of the extent to which what is meant to be a public service broadcaster, but in the case of Palestine and so many other global conflicts is in effect a state broadcaster, has completely manufactured the truth, manufactured the reality around the coverage of Gaza, Palestine, and now Israel strikes on Iran. And we're seeing it all play out in very similar ways, but at a much broader kind of geopolitical scale, and with the same scale of lives at stake, crimes against humanity being perpetrated. So that's the background to the report. And I think, as I say, we had last week, there was a communications blackout in Gaza. The Israeli occupation forces had completely stopped any telecom signals, any internet signals. We think there may have also been like a power blackout, but we're only just now actually getting reports from people in Palestine who have had their telecom signals. So for like 2 days, there was just like Palestine was effectively wiped out of global communication and Israel was free to do whatever it liked, but that just didn't feature in much coverage, whereas now Iranian retaliation to an Israeli assassinated strike against its military is treated as like the most horrible thing that's happened in recent memory. So it's very useful that this report has basically pointed out that Gaza is still happening, the siege of Gaza is still happening, Palestinians are still under occupation and starvation and siege. Something that had sort of just dropped, conveniently dropped out of coverage just at the time when the Israeli state was able to engage in another conflict to shore up its own geopolitical interests.
Jesus Christ, that was a lot.
It is a lot to take in. I mean, it's obviously happened within the same week when there's been the violence and police suppression of the anti-ICE protests in LA. There was the Madeleine aid flotilla, which was interdicted in international waters illegally, and its crew effectively kidnapped illegally by Israeli forces and then deported, which was of course all presented as like, oh, this is a vanity project by a bunch of hippie activists to try and deliver aid to a captive population. Really, within this last week, there's been a huge number of, or not a huge number, but really telling, revealing events happen, which I think broadly when people look at them and they can see who's in the right and who's in the wrong, whereas the coverage of it has broadly just been siding with state forces, police actors, international sensibilities, rather than the reality of what's been happening. How that plays into our own response to this, I think Debs and Kate may have sort of more direct things on this, but it plays into the same things we've been saying in this podcast time and time again, which is that all of these causes are linked across kind of state oppression, capitalist systems of control, getting involved in movements and solidarity campaigns and donating where you can and going on marches and showing that this is not normal, this is not acceptable, remains essential, and to not kind of be dragged around and led by whatever the news story of the week is, or literally the news story of the week rather than just the news story. Like the way that actually a lot of these media institutions are more than happy to move on to something else once something has gone quiet after 2 or 3 days. And, there's a trail of bodies being left behind. There are, American migrant families who have been separated or deported or imprisoned completely illegally. And that sort of seems to have disappeared off the news agenda because something else has happened. There are Iranian families who have lost members of their family have been killed in illegal Israeli strikes, and that will very quickly move out of the news agenda. Palestine is still under illegal occupation and starvation, and that literally could not have dropped off the news agenda any faster when it proved convenient to do so. I think our own sense of, we in some ways rely on these large institutions to sort of see what's going on in the world, but recognizing that other stuff is still going on, and actually recognizing that most of the accounts we're getting are false or misleading or actively complicit, and knowing that there are other movements and opposite views out there that we can take, I think is just essential to carry on and not feel sort of overwhelmed or detached from everything that's happening.
Yeah. And where have we been getting our information from, our news stories from? I think, at least in my feed, I get a lot of information in terms of what's happened from a perspective of people who have been affected rather than from the mainstream. But I'm curious to know where other folk get their information and how they consume it. So yeah, Kate, Debs.
I mean, I always go Al Jazeera if I want sort of up-to-date information about what's happening in that sort of region. I mean, obviously, if it's a thing that's specifically about Qatar, then I might not trust it. But in general, yeah, when I was trying to understand, like, see updates of what's happening between Israel and Iran, then I generally trust the Al Jazeera perspective on it.
I think I'm same as you. I get mine from Instagram.
How have you cultivated, actually, like, your Instagram page, would you say, in terms of the kind of people that you engage with, kind of people you follow, would you say?
It's cultivated itself, doesn't it, for me? Like, I follow certain things that are, various activists or whatever, and it starts to feed me stuff that it thinks I like. And then I guess I follow my friends, and that's not cultivated, but what they share. I mean, it will be cultivated. Like, Instagram will be feeding me the people I follow that I seem to, engage with the most. Yeah, so then I get my news from that. It's a strange way of living, because I wouldn't be someone who would, like, historically check the news anyway. And then you go online on this Instagram on your app, and you get fed, like, before you've even kind of got out of bed in the morning, all of this, like, insane levels of, like, horrific things that are happening in the world. And then you're like, right, well, time to get up and make tea. World War III's starting. Like, I don't know, it's a very strange way of living. We live such a horrible dystopia.
I've left Instagram now, but my Instagram was nothing like that. It was basically exclusively queer comedy reels.
Oh, that's
About it.
perfect. That's the dream. You're like the person I'm trying to advertise to on Instagram. If only the Instagram would let me pay for this goddamn ad. You could have come to my tour show. Yeah, it's funny. Like, my mother is on Instagram and follows like 3 accounts, which is like a knitting account, Monty Don from Gardener's World, and like her Instagram is so unbelievably. When I go on her like iPad and I'm like look through her For You page, it's like somehow very like floral and British, and I feel like it's like more of a neutral Instagram. It gives her lots of like bits of the royal family. She's not a royalist in any way, but I guess before they know who you are, they kind of feed you what they think is quite like a mainstream traditionalist thing. And then mine is like so different. Mine's so like radical, and then also like for some reason like nail art, because I'm always like fascinated by nail art, but like it's all this like radical stuff and like kind of like insane memes, and then like it's just funny to be like, wow, okay, that's where we're at.
I think also, like, we're not built for that level of intense disparity in terms of receiving so much input and then not really knowing what to do in terms of output, in terms of what we do with ourselves, in terms of how we then learn to compartmentalize really, really well, actually. And it's a skill that I feel like I find myself adopting more and more. And even on like a personal level, in terms of the crises we face, in terms of the people we lose, in terms of how we like end up relating to different people, different struggles, whether that's sort of through our friends or family. Like, that's when I think these things, when they collide and when you allow yourself to like sit in yourself and sit in how that actually makes you feel, I think the level of the almost the perpetual grieving process that we like are enduring in and of itself is something that we never really have time or space for. Yeah, which, even as I say this now, I think it's really intense. It's really, really, really intense. And to uplift also the kind of organizing, at least the organizing that I get on my For You page, that speaks to more local organizing, more local people, campaign groups and communities that are, for example, recently, like, they've done community meals and they've been able to essentially like create spaces in which these conversations are spoken about, in which we're angry about injustice, but we're also able to really come together and I think find the emotional, along with the material, the emotional support that is very much needed during that time as people adjacent to crisis and also living through crises that are themselves like entirely interdependent, interlocked, and woven through these systems of exploitation, as we've seen throughout this conversation. But I'm also quite curious to see other ways and general ways in which we resist these things. I guess I've just mentioned a few from my local area in terms of the organizing that we see, I guess, particularly around Palestine, because that was a Palestine community community deal, Jesus, community meal. But yeah, how do we see that in our own communities? How do you see that in your community, Debs?
I mean, I think when you go to the kind of Palestine demos here in Sheffield, it's really interesting to see the range of people that are there. And for example, there'll always be a Chilean person that will get up on the mic because there's quite a big Chilean community here that came in the 70s as political refugees. And there's a big link between Chile and Palestine. And yeah, I think, there's also quite a big Yemeni community here. There's always someone from the Yemeni community that gets up on the mic. I think sometimes seeing international solidarity as like, it doesn't always have to pass through the center, or it's like, in some ways Britain is kind of on the edges of a bunch of these things, and the most important forms of solidarity are happening between countries in the global south, and we're kind of, we can kind of use our resources or help to support that. I mean, there's absolutely loads of Palestinian people that have claimed asylum in Latin America. And it's interesting at this moment when Palestinians are facing so much repression in other places that they've settled, so facing so much repression in the States or here, whenever, actually, people that settled in Latin America are often in a stronger position to sort of act as a kind of powerful diaspora. So I think there's something about recognizing, for example, during the pandemic, Cuba was producing its own vaccines, and those vaccines were then being sold to Vietnam and to Iran, and being produced in those countries and sold to the regions, obviously at a lower cost than all of the big pharmaceuticals. I think there's something as well about, like, for example, with a country like Iran, I'm sure nobody listening to this podcast is like, whoa, big up Khomeini. Like, nobody likes the government of Iran. Like, this is not. And it can be really difficult to find ways to be in solidarity with the people of a country when they're literally being so kind of cut off and also so stereotyped. But it's so clear that the there is this big public support for a different way, a different kind of government, a different way of living that is being like really, really brutally repressed. I guess the really significant thing about this Cuban vaccine is that, that link between Cuba and Iran is like two countries that have been under sanctions for decades. And the people that have suffered for that have been their own peoples who are then cut off from like basic supplies. But they've actually found another way to do it because Cuba has like massively invested in medical technology and is spreading those things to other countries. So I suppose there's something about just kind of recognizing that and not seeing like Britain as the center of the world or as the place where these solutions are going to come from, and taking the time and the effort to learn about things that aren't just like coming up on our news agenda. So another place to look for that kind of stuff is the New Internationalist, which is a media co-op. It's been running for decades, and they do much more like long form pieces, but they do a lot of, so it's not going to, it's not like the news agenda in that way, but there is a lot about grassroots movements in different parts of the world. And I think just even having that perspective of like, it's not all about us can be helpful.
This think global, act local sentiment that I guess you're alluding to there as well. I quite like it. I see it in even just like the things that are released by Solidarity Econ, the Solidarity Economy Association, who also are distributing Dope magazine as of recently, which is really, really cool. So definitely check it out. Check out their recent book as well. And the fact that they like their Solidarity Econ book in particular highlights a series of case studies actually that we see around the world. And I think generally they do share that on their socials. So like if you're curious to know about different movements, different people, as you say, use the example of Cuba. I like to use the example of the Zapatistas always, but it's, it goes beyond, there's more to it. And I think it's really beautiful what we can do in terms of learning around the methodologies that people use to approach their given circumstances, and understanding that there are these like linked themes in terms of how we can actually organize, but fundamentally rooting it to our local context, because, we live differently, we exist differently, we relate differently. And it's very important to always contextualize our organizing with our own lived experiences, I find. So thank you for sharing that, Debs. Any other thoughts, Tom, actually, as you were the one obviously who's introduced this topic?
I think we've covered, broadening out this story of, the report on the failure of Palestine media coverage, how it connects to other quote unquote news stories. Like Debs was saying, it's like probably better to not think of these in terms of things that are on the news agenda, but events that are happening across the world all the time and have so many interconnected relationships and pieces to them that go back decades or even centuries. I think, and then tying that to your point of news burnout, or just the way that we get drawn into these cycles of seeing one story, then another, then something about nail art, or different things that the swirl of stuff that gets thrown across our social media feeds. I think all of that points to the importance of joining or starting a news club, because by getting together with people like in the way we've been doing here, it's like you can say, oh, I was really concerned by this news story today and I don't really get it, but it looks bad, and somebody in that group may know the history behind it, or may be able to tell you about the groups or the news outlets or the histories of what's going on. And just by doing that, you found a way around a news story that was otherwise just like this thing being blared out of your screen towards you with no context or understanding. We know, and we're becoming increasingly aware of, and we have statistics to show that our mainstream news organizations on the big issues that are happening in the world right now are completely failing. But that doesn't mean that has to be the only way we get information about this stuff. So taking those snippets of failed BBC coverage, or really atrocious Fox News coverage, or footage of Trump's parade, which I would have loved to have talked to about this week because it was just absolutely mental. But stuff that's happening in the world, and just finding ways to talk about it with people from your community, rather than seeing it as like a BBC News bulletin that's in one ear and out the other, I think is really important, just to like ground ourselves and understand that these are things that are happening in the world instead of things that are just happening on our screens. Join and start a news club.
Join and start a news club. Thank you for that. I'm actually also really curious to know your thoughts on this, Kate. Like, what would you like to say? What has been unsaid so far?
Well, I don't know. I think we know that the figures are not accurate that were coming from. We knew that was the deal. Yeah. I don't know if I have anything more to say that's more interesting or good.
No, I think you've hit the point. That's why I think these kinds of reports are so useful, because everybody has that sense, and they sort of know just from their own experience and their own rational thinking that the images I'm seeing on my screen do not line up with the commentary I'm being given by spokespeople or presenters or journalists. But then having an organisation like the Centre for Media Monitoring come out and say, well, here's the numbers behind that failure. And here's like, if someone says to you, oh, it's not as bad as all that, you're overstating it. Oh, and then, maybe at 3:00 in the morning, we played a piece which did give the Palestinian perspective. It's like, well, these research organizations have shown that for the one time that you gave a Palestinian perspective, you were giving the Israeli state perspective 200 more times in exchange. So
I think people that that need the statistics for the validation.
Yeah.
Then it's incredibly good, I guess. To me, it's just all, I mean, it's part of like a broader thing of Enlightenment thinking, isn't it? Like, it's just part of a broader thing that's like, we believe stuff when we have the statistics for it. Well, we knew, and I think the problem is we've known now since it started, really, in October, that this has been not treated fairly or treated right by the media. And this, I don't know how much I feel like being said, like saying, oh, it's not, is going to do anything, because the whole point is there's like an establishment that just doesn't want to do anything about it. And I don't think you fight. It's like the kind of like, it's just like the Audre Lorde thing, isn't it? You don't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And that's always the difficulty of like our media reform campaigns that some of us in this call have been involved in, is trying to go about changing these institutions through formal mechanisms or through nice, clear arguments. But I think actually going into the master's house and pointing out how shit that house is, even if it's just like really exciting and fun to do, can actually have like, really effective potential. Because I remember back in sort of 2003 when the Iraq War had started and civilian casualties were becoming more and more obvious, and the handful of anti-war people who were going on live TV had been interviewed as like, the throwaway spokesperson for the anti-war coalition. Like, they would go in with statistics, and they would actually, person to person, confront a news presenter and say, what you've just said is false. And I think, no, that's not going to topple a regime. No, that's not going to end the war overnight. But I think just, to take your analogy, going into the master's house and pointing out how shit it is sometimes one of the only tools we have. And having the tools to go in and point out this sucks and is rubbish.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I think about it on a kind of philosophical belief, I think that's the problem. Is I think it's presented as us as the only tool we have, and we have so many more tools, but we were not going to ever use them because we're told that the only tools that are effective, the only tools that will be accepted, is these methods. And I think in the end of the day, if we really wanted to stop Palestine, if we had striked, we would end it in a week. Like, if everyone was striking, and we just won't, because we're not told that that's a method. And as much as everyone tries to continue to like build like strikes or no buy days, or they just don't gather momentum because we've been sold the idea that the tool to do this is these specific channels and whatever.
Do you have ideas of like how those tools will become more effective? Because I agree. I think like what we talk about on this podcast oftentimes is a variety of different methodologies, tactics, and tools that we know we have in our arsenal, ones that range from cooperation with existing institutions to complete challenging and dismantling of those institutions. Like what do you know, what would you want us to do? What would you want people to do? What do you see as being the bridge for transformation, as you know, people wanting to
If
do
you want to
things
put in this example,
in general. But if this example helps, then of course.
I think it would be a strike. I think people should do nothing. But I don't think you can ask people under capitalism to do nothing. I don't think they know how to do nothing. Don't go to work, don't buy stuff, do nothing. Go and be with people. They can't do it. You can't tell people not to do that. They don't know how to do that. We've become so, I'm like the same. I can't really rest anymore. Like I can't really disengage. Because every moment I'm resting, I think, oh, now it's my time to go and do something. Because it's so inbuilt in us of like this productivity or whatever. Go and do more, share more. But no, everyone did nothing. Shut it down.
Absolutely. We said this before, right? Sometimes the most productive thing you can do is nap while you're on the job. Thank you for those thoughts, Kate. Thank you for reflecting on that. So yeah, we've looked at Welsh independence, the exploitation, at the heart of the arts, and how media and states collude to control the story, from Gaza to Iran to the stories we see at present in our news media and our feeds, if we choose to engage with it. And so yeah, thank you so very much, everyone, for your time, for your thoughts, for your reflections. I would just like to draw people's attention, obviously, to our podcast, to our newsletter, to what else we have to say, and to starting these conversations in your own spaces, in your own communities. So yeah, make sure to follow us, and thank you so very much for your time. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.